For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. These two giants have stood here for over 3,000 years, watching the sun rise over the Nile day after day. To passing travelers in the Roman period, they were simply the Colossi of Memnon. But they were never meant to be silent sentinels. They were part of something much larger. These two colossal statues depict Amenhotep III, who ruled Egypt around 1370 BCE, give or take, near the peak of its imperial wealth and power.
Amenhotep III, often thought as one of the greatest pharaohs of the New Kingdom because it was a period of great building activity and prosperity. In fact, so many monuments were put up by Amenhotep III that some earlier Egyptologists thought there's no way he couldn't have reigned less than 100 years to make all these things. So they used to give him a really long reign length. Now they've got him down to about 30-some odd years. But he did produce more monuments than any other king of the New Kingdom.
Both statues were originally identical, about 18 meters tall, made of quartzite sandstone, and seated on thrones that show carved scenes of the king's power and divine support. The carvings on the sides show Hapi, the Nile god, binding together the plants of Upper and Lower Egypt, a symbol of unification and a classic motif in royal temples. But here's the thing. These statues weren't standalone monuments. They were just the outer gateway to the vast mortuary temple of Amenhotep III.
This was part of a giant temple, actually the largest temple that was built in the New Kingdom, stretching all the way along here. These two statues of himself were sort of guardians before you enter into the temple area. It goes this is just the forecourt area here, but it stretches all the way back to almost as far as you can see.
Despite their appearance, which makes it look like they were assembled from many pieces, they originally were each single blocks of stone. The quartzite used to carve these statues came from Jebel el Ahmar, a quarry near modern-day Cairo. That's over 675 kilometers to the north, straight-line distance. The stone wasn't local. It had to be quarried, carved, and then transported hundreds of kilometers before the finishing touches were ever applied. How do we know this is where the stone came from? Well, Amenhotep tells us so himself in an inscription, but he was fact-checked. Geologists analyzed the mineral composition and grain structure of the quartzite in the statues. The fingerprint matches the outcrops at Jebel el Ahmar, but not quartzite from anywhere else in Egypt. The color, too, a kind of reddish-yellow ochre, is characteristic of that site. You'll often hear that the Colossi of Memnon each weighed somewhere around 720 tons. But where does that number come from? Let's not just repeat it. Let's figure it out. First, we estimate the volume of the statue. These aren't simple cylinders or cubes, but we can break the shape down into components: the seated body, the throne block, the base underneath. Based on photogrammetry and earlier measurements, we can approximate an overall volume of 270 to 275 cubic meters. So our final estimate, about 721 metric tons. That's about 1.6 million pounds, roughly the weight of 4 fully loaded Boeing 747s. The ancient Egyptians didn't just carve this out of stone, they had to move it. How did they do it? The first thing to think about is how they took it up the Nile. They were quarried over 600 kilometers to the north. That means they had to travel upriver against the current of the Nile. One statue, 720 metric tons. Could the Egyptians really float that on a wooden barge? For anything to float, it needs to displace its own weight in water. Add a 10% safety margin, and that's 792 metric tons. That means the barge would need to displace 792 cubic meters of water to stay afloat. Now let's assume the barge sits about 1.2 meters deep in the water, what we call the draft. Egyptian river vessels, including cargo barges, were flat-bottomed for stability and shallow water navigation. To displace that much water at that depth, it would need a surface area of about 660 square meters. A barge roughly 33 meters long by 20 meters wide would do the job, well within the range of ancient Egyptian shipbuilding. We actually have ancient documentation that barges of this size were made by the Egyptians of this period. During the reign of Thutmose I, 2 massive obelisks were carried downriver from Aswan to Thebes aboard a specially constructed vessel. The architect responsible, Ineni, proudly recorded in an inscription that the ship measured 120 cubits long by 40 cubits wide. That's roughly 63 meters long and 21 meters wide. If Thutmose I's engineers could build and operate ships of this scale a generation earlier, there's no doubt that Amenhotep III's builders could have matched or even surpassed such impressive engineering feats. At Hatshepsut's temple, we see in the reliefs a flat-bottomed barge carrying 2 obelisks on one boat. They weighed a total of about 650 tons. From what we can tell by the illustrations, it was built of wood, joined with mortise and tenon, lashed together with rope, and sealed with pitch and reeds. But how do you load a 720-ton statue onto a wooden barge? Well, consider, if you will, that in 2018, archaeologists discovered a specialized sledge and ramp system at Hatnub, featuring a steep incline, timber posts set into the ramp at intervals, and rope grooves that allowed teams to control the load's descent. The system allowed workers to pull upward on sledges, using tension and friction strategically, and not just brute force. While this setup was used for quarrying rather than river transport, it demonstrates that the Egyptians could engineer complex traction systems over sloped terrain. To load a barge with a colossus, they probably used a similar sloped embankment, fitted with log rollers, a compacted clay slipway, and rope control posts to guide and stabilize the descent. The barge itself could be hauled onto land. The statue would be placed directly on its deck, and the vessel floated off once the river rose. Now let's talk about movement. Since they went upriver, they wouldn't just float the barge downstream, as would be the case if they were going in the other direction. You might think, sails. But for this kind of load, not likely. A single gust in the wrong direction could tip or capsize a barge this massive. Instead, the Egyptians probably used shore-based tow lines. According to this calculation, you'd need just over 50 people to keep the barge moving steadily upstream, if the river was calm and the barge well designed. But the Egyptians wouldn't have cut it close. They probably would have used 70 or 80 people, maybe more, to tow the statue upriver in shifts. So yes, they had to fight the current, but with skilled crews, strong ropes, and a river-tested hull, they absolutely could have done it. In total, the river journey from Cairo to Thebes would take several weeks, but with steady supervision, it was well within the logistical capabilities of 18th dynasty engineers. Getting the statue here was no small feat, but the real challenge, now they had to haul it over land to the temple site. The mortuary temple site is on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. The archaeological site, which is called Kom el Hatan, is about 3 kilometers from the river. But back in Amenhotep III's time, the river flowed much closer. Descriptions from geoarchaeological studies and excavation reports indicate that a Nile channel flowed directly adjacent to the temple platform, but no precise distance measurement has been published. The river gradually shifted eastward over the centuries. For our calculations, let's assume a long distance of 250 meters, but they may have dug a canal going even closer than that. The terrain around the temple was relatively flat and broad, part of the floodplain, had ample room for large-scale construction staging, was not hemmed in by cliffs or tight canyons, so in general, space was not an issue in this particular location. In a 2020 study, Egyptologist Simon Delvaux examined scenes like the famous statue-hauling relief from the tomb of Jehuti-Hotep, which shows a colossal alabaster statue on a sledge being dragged by rope teams. Delvaux carefully estimated the statue's mass, about 58,000 kilograms, and counted the number of visible workers, 172 men. He then divided the load among the pullers, estimating each man was responsible for about 336 to 348 kilograms of sliding weight, not lifting it, just overcoming friction. That matches what we find in experimental archaeology. With proper lubrication, like pouring water on the sand, the requiring pulling force drops dramatically. So, how much pulling force could one person generate under those conditions? Converting the sliding load to actual pulling force means each worker would be exerting around 650 newtons. That means it would require a minimum of 2,173 workers to pull a sled with one of the colossi on it. So let's round it up to 2,200, a labor force well within the capabilities of the New Kingdom administration. The answer isn't to tie 2,200 ropes to the statue. Instead, the Egyptians likely used a tiered towing system, a few thick lead ropes attached to the sledge. From those, a fan of worker ropes extended outward, each manned by a team. But here's the thing. If the fan of ropes is too wide, the outer teams pull at sharp angles, wasting energy. If the ropes are too long, they're hard to coordinate and keep taut. So what's the sweet spot? With about 2,200 workers, the optimal setup would be 22 ropes, each with 100 people. At 1.2 meters of lateral space per team, the maximum required road width is 26.4 meters. This width ensures that each team has enough room to operate without crowding. The rope fan can stay aligned and tensioned, and workers have room to maneuver and follow instructions without tangling ropes. Keep in mind, the Egyptians didn't build a highway. They custom-prepared hauling surfaces, tailored to each project. 27 meters wide is only at the widest part of the rope fan, just in front of the statue. The rest of the operation could taper inward or stagger groups. It would not have been a paved avenue, but more likely a specially cleared and prepared track, made smooth, compacted, and perhaps lined with lubricated sand. It possibly had shallow ruts or guide grooves for sled stability. But only the track directly beneath and immediately ahead of the statue's sled would need to be meticulously prepared and smoothed. The rest of the corridor, where the rope teams fanned out, could be far less refined. It just needed to be cleared of large stones or obstacles. Some tripping or slippage wouldn't halt progress as long as the ropes remained taut. Also, no carts, axle clearance, or turning radii were needed. The road could be graded and prepared specifically for this one-time move, and labor for the road prep was abundant. So how long would this actually take? A good estimate is a steady haul rate of about 20 to 30 meters per hour on lubricated sand. That accounts for friction, human endurance, stop-start adjustments, and rest periods. With crews working in rotating shifts, perhaps 4 to 6 hours a day, the whole operation likely took about 4 to 5 days for each statue. What we're looking at here is not brute force, but precision logistics, and it's totally within the scope of what 18th Dynasty Egypt could accomplish. No out-of-place technology, just clever engineering, organization, and a deep understanding of teamwork.
So, not quite as heavy as that colossal statue of Ramses we just saw, but very, very heavy. Again, an example to show how Egyptian engineering was able to move objects of this weight.
Today we see just 2 statues, standing side by side at the entrance to a vanished temple. But these weren't the only ones. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III was once the largest in Thebes, larger than Karnak during his reign, and he filled it with statues. Thanks to the work of archaeologists like Hurig Soruzian and the Colossi of Memnon and Amenhotep III Temple Conservation Project, we now know that the original temple grounds were crowded with full-scale colossi. Some seated, some standing, many Osiride in form, resembling the god Osiris. The surviving pair once flanked the first pylon, the temple's front gate. But there were more at the second and third pylons, and within the courts beyond. You can see another one there in the background, recently reconstructed. Excavations at Qom el-Hatan, the site of the temple, have uncovered the remains of at least 28 seated colossi of Amenhotep III, plus dozens more standing statues and sphinxes. The team has re-erected 4 seated colossi so far, with 8 more awaiting reconstruction. So what we see today is just the tip of the iceberg. The 2 colossi were once part of a forest of stone giants. Standing here today, it's hard to imagine that this was once the largest temple in Thebes. Now there's almost nothing left. So what happened? Was there some catastrophic event? Yes, indeed. The collapse began early, around 1200 BCE, still in the New Kingdom, and right around the time of the Trojan War. A massive earthquake struck Thebes, toppling the temple. Roofs collapsed, courts filled with rubble. There are still signs of shear fractures, and many statue fragments were found right where they fell, half buried in the soil. The quake destabilized the temple's foundations, and the site was abandoned.
There were earthquakes that damaged it, floods, and then, of course, what often happens in Egypt, once something starts to fall apart, people then figure, well, hey, it's fair game, let's just start taking stuff from it. And for other buildings, people began taking stones and other things to build buildings elsewhere. And so there's not much left anymore.
Over the centuries, it became a quarry. Blocks of sandstone, granite, and quartzite were hauled away and reused in later temples and tombs. Some made it as far as Karnak. Over subsequent generations, the Nile's annual floodwaters inundated the damaged structure by up to 2.5 meters, burying statues and architectural fragments in mud. By the time the Greeks and Romans came to Thebes, the temple was already gone. Only the front gate and its colossi remained. In 27 BCE, there was another earthquake that struck, and the upper half of the northern colossus broke off. A fracture in the bottom half resulted in an interesting phenomenon. At dawn on certain days, people heard a faint, high-pitched tone, like a whisper from stone. The statue was singing. The Greeks and Romans were fascinated. They believed the statue was Memnon, son of Eos, goddess of the dawn, and that his voice was a greeting to his mother. That's how these statues got their name.
They were, by the Greeks, attached to this figure called Memnon. He was a character from the Trojan War stories in Homer. It is said that when the Greeks fought Troy, on the side of the Trojans, there was an African king that was so heroic in battle, he got killed by Achilles, but even the Greeks thought he was great. And he was supposed to be from Africa. In the 3rd century BCE, the Egyptian priest who wrote the history of Egypt in Greek, Manetho, he connected this Memnon figure with Amenhotep, who is actually depicted in these statues, and so that further cemented this idea that those figures are actually of Memnon. This place got called the Memnonium when people came here one day and they heard, well actually not just one day, many days, and they heard noises coming from the statues. They heard these noises coming from the statues, and it became thought of it was an oracle, and people would come here to get a prophecy. They'd have someone interpret the sounds, and the sounds would be a fortune.
Visitors came from across the empire, hoping to hear it. Some even left their names behind. The prefect of Egypt wrote one inscription: "In the 5th year of Hadrian our emperor, Titus Hetirius Nepos, prefect of Egypt, heard Memnon on the 12th day before the calends of March, at the 1st hour and a half. The date corresponds to February 18th, 121 CE, and is one of the earliest precisely datable inscriptions recording the singing of the Colossus." In the year 130, the poet Caecilia Trebula wrote on the leg of one of the colossi, "When I heard the holy voice of Memnon, I longed for you, mother, and I prayed for you to hear it too." A scientific explanation is that after the earthquake, cracks in the statue allowed morning dew to seep inside. As the sun rose and warmed the stone, the moisture evaporated suddenly, producing a faint whistling sound. The singing stopped after the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus had the statue repaired around the year 199, sealing the cracks that made the sound possible. But by then the legend had taken hold. For centuries, the northern Colossus was called the Vocal Memnon. These statues weren't just decorations. They were boundary markers between worlds, between divine and mortal. The Colossi of Memnon are the last witnesses of a lost temple. But they're not a mystery. They're a challenge to look closer, to run the numbers, and to give the past the credit it deserves. These aren't relics of some forgotten super-civilization. They're the legacy of real people with incredible ambition. You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word. So feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.